Modern historical and pseudo-historical films, books, and games may spark an interest in the past, especially in the Middle Ages, but at the same time, their one-sided portrayal of ancient technology becomes fertile ground for all sorts of conspiracy theories. This might be because most modern people are far removed from hard physical labor or jobs where it's not just about making it to payday, but about accomplishing massive volumes of work. Only a few people, maybe those who've gone through certain student internships or have faced tough life situations, truly understand human potential and how such work, when done with enthusiasm, can result in radically different outcomes compared to just being a paid employee. Moreover, in the 21st century, when many have changed a dozen jobs and tried out a bunch of fields by the time they're 25, it's hard to grasp what a craftsman, who worked at their trade from childhood to old age, was capable of. As a result, you often hear things like, you can't shape stone without diamond-tipped tools, move heavy blocks without cranes, or forge metal plates without a rolling mill, and so on. Against this backdrop, the full plate armor that appeared in the late 14th century seems like some kind of technological breakthrough, something incredible for its time. However, among the things blacksmiths were crafting when the first suits of plate armor appeared, there were some items that didn't blow the minds of so-called alternative researchers, probably only because they simply don't know about them. By 1300, Europe already had functional gunpowder formulas, and just a few decades later, the first firearms appeared, basically primitive tubes with a sealed end. The effectiveness of these devices was likely mediocre, but there was probably one key factor at play. Even in the relatively peaceful 21st century, many people are fascinated by weapons. In the Middle Ages, there was an entire class of wealthy feudal lords who literally lived for war. So, these early firearms didn't need to be particularly effective to attract attention. If you take a look at a map of all the major battles from the beginning to the end of the Middle Ages, you'll see that Western and Central Europe were incredibly tumultuous places. And while our history textbooks might mention a ton of military clashes, in reality, Eastern Europe was relatively quiet compared to the more Western lands. Also, it's important to understand that in modern films, battles are depicted with rich soundtracks to convey their intensity. In reality, though, the occasional shouts and the clang of metal were nothing compared to the work of modern heavy artillery, the sounds of explosions or gunfire. In the past, a traveler could pass by a battlefield a kilometer or two away and not even realize a fight was going on. But things changed in the early stages of the 100 Years' War when England began to seize French lands. In 1340, the English used their first small cannons during the Siege of Tournai. Records tell us about 412 kilograms of saltpeter and 380 kilograms of sulfur among the English army's supplies. In 1346, English King Edward III used cannons in the famous Battle of Crécy, which is mainly associated with the effectiveness of English longbowmen. It's worth noting that this was a time when full knightly armor still didn't exist in Europe. These cannons were likely made of bronze, were relatively small, and had a narrow caliber. We only have a few references to them in written sources. Their main effect seems to have been psychological, likely scaring people and horses with their loud noise. However, the most interesting developments began in the second half of the 14th century, when people realized that cannons could be made larger, turning them into truly formidable weapons. During this period, saltpeter production pits, a mixture of manure and lime used to produce the rarest component of gunpowder, started appearing all over Europe. There were two main methods for producing cannon barrels. They could be cast from bronze, though casting on such a scale was extremely difficult. The barrel walls had to be quite thick. Alternatively, the barrel could be forged. It sounds strange, but the process was fairly straightforward for blacksmiths of that time. They forged long strips of metal, much like wooden planks. Then, they essentially did the same thing as coopers when making barrels. They shaped the strips into a cylinder and fitted heated rings over them. As the rings cooled, they shrank and tightened the steel barrel. If a really large barrel was needed, 2 or even 3 layers of steel strips were used. The result was something impressive. In 1388, just around the time the first suits of plate armor appeared, the gunsmiths of Nuremberg created something poetically named Kriemhild. The finished product weighed 3 tons, the same as 100 suits of plate armor, and the cannonball weighed 220 kilograms. It's worth mentioning that 1 cubic meter of steel weighs nearly 8 tons, so while the numbers sound impressive, 3 tons of steel is roughly the size of a cube with 73 centimeter sides. Marble, which was used for cannonballs in the 14th and 15th centuries, has a density of 2.5 tons per cubic meter. meaning a 220-kilogram cannonball would have had a diameter of about 55 centimeters, with some margin of error. Slightly earlier, in 1382, the Gent cannon was used during the siege of Oudenarde. Its barrel was forged from 32 longitudinal iron strips and held together by 41 hoops. The barrel was 5.5 meters long with a caliber of 64 centimeters. The cannonball weighed 270 kilograms. The 15th century, the time when plate armor developed rapidly, is known as the age of enormous cannons. However, it's important to note that these monstrous weapons are more accurately referred to as bombards. There's some confusion here since, in modern terminology, a bombard is a weapon whose barrel is no more than 5 to 6 times the caliber. In the Middle Ages, there were no strict criteria, and the term could be applied to any large weapon, and the weapons were truly large. Take, for example, the bombard made in 1449 called the Mons Meg, weighing over 6 tons, or the insane Great Great, which weighed more than 16 tons and could fire cannonballs weighing over 320 kilograms. And all of this was crafted by blacksmiths at an immense cost. In 1442 alone, Jean Bureau supplied the French royal court with 6 bombards and about 80 smaller cannons for a total of 4,198 livres. They also purchased gunpowder for 2,200 livres. With that kind of money, you could have bought 160 full suits of plate armor. There are plenty of examples of multi-ton bombards from the 15th century in history. Not a single major battle of that time was fought without them, and some examples have survived to this day. The problem is that historical films depicting late medieval events often ignore artillery. On one hand, this creates a skewed view of the era for the audience, and on the other, it prevents me from putting together an interesting and lengthy video sequence. It's difficult to pinpoint exactly where and when the first truly effective large-caliber firearms appeared, but France is rightfully considered the birthplace of artillery. It was the French brothers Jean and Gaspard Bureau who established the positions of gunners, artillery supervisors, and wagoners, standardized calibers, and ultimately made artillery an independent branch of the military. While the early stages of the 100 Years' War and the successes of the English are often associated with English longbowmen, the French victories in the mid-15th century and their eventual win in the war are linked to their artillery superiority. From 1449 to 1450, the French successfully completed 60 sieges. If in the past a siege was a lengthy affair, often lasting months, bombards made it possible to resolve things in a matter of weeks or even days. For instance, while the siege of Rouen in 1418 by the English took nearly 6 months, the French recaptured the city in 1449 in just 3 days. It's important to understand that, in the Middle Ages, there was no cement mortar, and castles were built using lime and clay. Modern builders would describe such mortar as having poor adhesion, meaning it fills the spaces between stones without actually binding them together. As a result, a stone wall mainly relied on its own weight for stability. Heavy cannonballs could shift the block slightly, which was manageable with just 1 or 2 hits. However, after numerous strikes, the wall could become loose, lose its shape, and risk collapsing. Often, it was more effective to target the weakest sections of a fortress with cannon fire, typically the castle or city gates. Reports suggest that a shot from a large bombard could take out 5 or 6 enemy soldiers at once, although this is difficult to verify. Additionally, firing such cannons involved igniting 60 to 80 pounds of gunpowder, which would significantly heat the barrel. Thus, achieving 1 shot every few hours was considered a decent rate of fire. Nevertheless, artillery played a crucial role in the 100 Years' War and marked the end for Constantinople. By the mid-15th century, the Ottomans had taken control of nearly all remaining Byzantine territories, with only the Grand City left unconquered. Sultan Ahmed II had the resources to hire a Hungarian cannon maker named Urban, who, in 1453, created the enormous bronze cannon known as the Basilica. Measuring nearly 26 feet in length, it could fire stone balls weighing half a ton. Transporting this massive cannon required 30 pairs of oxen and hundreds of laborers. It became pivotal in capturing the last vestige of the Roman Empire, an event that shocked Europe. A later example of such weaponry is the Tsar cannon, cast in 1586. However, when we look back at the wrought iron bombards of the late 14th and 15th centuries, an interesting question arises. Why did these cannons have larger calibers than their later counterparts, yet their barrel walls were thinner? The answer lies in the fact that they fired stone cannonballs. The technology for casting iron balls advanced throughout the 15th century. Since stone is approximately 2.5 to 3 times less dense than iron, a stone ball weighing around 400 pounds would have a diameter of about 21 inches, whereas an iron ball of the same weight would be around 15 inches. On one hand, gunpowder had an easier time pushing a stone ball out of the barrel, which reduced the risk of the bombard exploding, though accidents could happen, as evidenced by the death of Scottish King James II, who had a passion for cannons. On the other hand, stone balls traveled at lower speeds and did not fly as effectively as iron ones. For wrought iron bombards, the typical range when firing stone balls was between 1,600 and 2,300 feet. In contrast, switching to iron allowed for ranges of several miles. This shift led regions like Flanders and France to adopt metal balls and the necessary blast furnaces in the latter half of the 15th century. The main takeaway from this video is quite straightforward. The era of full-plate armor coincided with the existence of relatively effective artillery and a certain level of blacksmithing sophistication. The bombard could arguably be considered the most destructive weapon produced by traditional blacksmithing techniques.